Hello, it's Jack Tutor here of Attention Magazine. Welcome to Crucial Listening, the podcast where I speak with musicians and sound artists about 3 albums that are important to them. My guest this time is Francisco López, who has released a ton of work across the realms of experimental music and sound art. Francisco is currently based in Newport, Ireland. And he released a new album late last year called Conveyor Belts USA, which was made by putting a portable audio recorder inside checked-in baggage in airports across the US. And then what you're hearing on this record is the unedited, untransformed recordings of the baggage going through those unseen conveyor belts, which is amazing. It's such a good record. We talk about that in the intro. But Francisco's work goes everywhere. You've got extremes of duration, such as one of his recent 24-hour albums. You've got extremes of dynamics. One of my favorite works by him is Press 2, released online, which is a compilation of very, very quiet works that he did. You've got various different explorations of fidelity, working in reduced and degraded fidelities, as well as sparkling hi-fi. He's done a lot of work in rainforests and countless different environments. I mean, Francisco is very much mapping out the extremes of sound across almost every vector. It's beautiful to behold. I mean, you can dive in anywhere. Go over to Francisco's Bandcamp. I'll include a link in the show notes. And yeah, have fun. So we start this discussion diving straight in. I was actually in the middle of my preliminary chat, just figuring out what we were going to talk about. Francisco mentioned an upcoming work centered on rainforests in Thailand. So we kind of dive straight in. There's, no hello at the start of this one. It's a fabulous chat. Francisco has so many thoughts around sound and his approach to it and his perspective on it. It's such a pleasure to speak to him. If you're enjoying the podcast generally, you can support it, by the way. You can go over to ko-fi.com/crucial listening, where you can make a donation, one-off or monthly, any amount you please. It goes into helping keep the podcast ticking. Thank you so much. Or just, tell someone about it. Give it one of those reviews. Thank you very much. Anyway, without any further delay, this is Francisco López on Crucial Listening. The Rainforest in Thailand project, so that's a record, is it? It's a record that's due to be coming out soon?
Yeah, I mean, it will come out. I'm finishing. I'm in the last stages of this project. It's a project that started 2 years ago, and with recordings in different national parks in Thailand. This was done in collaboration with the National Park Service in Thailand, and through the instigation of an organization in Bangkok called Bangkok 1899. It's an organization based in Bangkok and Los Angeles, and they do they organize different activities, cultural activities of different types, not specifically sound or music, in Bangkok. So I proposed this idea, and it was a far-fetched idea, but in the end it worked. And in short, as you probably know, I've been working in rainforests all over the world my entire life, and also as a biologist. And they are a big part of my personal story as a composer, as an artist. And my surprise after having visited and worked in many different rainforest environments, my surprise was Thailand, how incredibly rich and how wild some places in Thailand are even today. And so that was fascinating. That was a very interesting project. It was very productive and is going to materialize in a number of different ways. I did some performances in Bangkok last year with the first version, a performance version of the sound piece that I created from those recordings. And it will materialize hopefully soon in the form of a long duration album in the range of several hours. With a composition created with those recordings, with no transformation, with no processing or anything of the recordings, but a lot of editing work and a lot of what I would consider to be composition work from those recordings. So it's a big project for me, and is in the last stages of the mastering process right now. So that will be released on my Bandcamp site as well as a long duration, a digital album, at least initially.
A follow-up question on this then. Obviously, as you say, you spent a lot of time recording in rainforests. And I imagine every rainforest that you go into has its own intricacies based on where it's at, the terrain, etc. But as your general approach to spending time in those environments in terms of whether simply as you're inhabiting them or how you're recording them, has that changed over the time that you've been working in those kind of environments?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a good question. Because the impact of the experience of those environments, the experience is multi whatever you want to put after multi. It's because for me, the experience of listening in those environments, it's as important as the experience of recording. And those two experiences are different. I do not think of recording as a form of representation, as a form of gathering or keeping or capturing. These are common terms, common metaphors to refer to recording. I don't see recording as something that replaces or that keeps something that I get from listening. I think listening and recording provide very different things, complementary, but very different things. And the impact of both are, is in my view, in my personal experience, is complementary. I spend a lot of time listening and spending time experiencing those environments for a number of reasons. And originally, years ago, it happened while I was doing research in biology and spending extensive amounts of time in those environments. But my goal in those places is not to record. I'm happy that happens, but that's not the main goal. And like I said, it doesn't replace the listening. I think recording creates something that is not possible with listening, and vice versa. So I think for that reason, and this makes for a very, very long conversation about what recording and what sound is and what sound environments are. But in short, I think that when your goal is not to represent, is not to simulate an experience of reality, but is to access layers of that reality, aspects of that reality that are not accessible through listening, and vice versa. Recording provides with something that we cannot do. I insist on this, and I've been insisting on this for many years. I think the main quality that recording machines have is that they do something we cannot do. They can perceive reality within their perceptive range, within their capabilities, without thinking. This is something we cannot do. So non-cognitive machines like sound recorders this is the main advantage, the main quality, the main power they have is that they don't think. And I think this is particularly relevant now in the present because we are losing that. Most machines will be cognitive machines. They're starting to be cognitive machines already, and they will be cognitive in the near future. So at some point in history, we will have lost this stage of non-cognitive machines. And I think that would be a big loss. I think it's probably natural evolution in terms of technology and the interaction between humans and technology. But I think it is for me, it is crucial to understand the non-cognitive ability of these machines.
A few of these points, I think, tie in with another project that I wanted to talk to you about, which is Conveyor Belts USA, which is a record that came out right at the end of last year and that you recorded last year too, which is centered on non-transformed, unedited, original recordings done with a portable audio recorder running inside checked-in baggage, going through conveyor belts of baggage handling systems in the US, which, as a concept, I felt almost like this childlike rush of like, that's the question that you always ask when you're a kid going into airports, like, where the hell has my baggage been? And it felt like this kind of, on one level, tapped into that. And I felt some of that childlike excitement even listening to the record. But at the same time, I guess the first question I wanted to ask, there's several directions to go here. You put this on several of your records, the fact that there is distortion on the audio, which is like an aesthetic decision.
Right.
It's very pronounced, particularly on like the last track, I think, is it Los Angeles? And there are certain scenarios in which I know that would be undesirable for certain people either working with sound or listening to it, where it's like suddenly the medium is announcing itself very brashly upon what you're listening to. I think it's a wonderful decision to make, and it triggers so many thoughts in itself. But can you talk about this aesthetic decision of having a distortion within the material that you're presenting?
Right. I mean, two things. One is that distortion, as we know, audio distortion, it's part of the history of popular music in the mostly in the 20th century, but not exclusively. The entire history of rock and roll, and not only heavy metal, but rock and roll in a wide sense, heavy metal in a wide sense. But the entire history of rock and roll is based on the idea of making an aesthetic decision as to what distortion is or can do. The history of the electric guitar, for example, in terms of the aesthetic and in terms of the contribution to music making and to generating new genres of music and new types of music, it's one important component there is distortion. And distortion turned into an aesthetic in many different ways. So to me, it is no surprise that to make decisions as to voluntary, even forceful inclusion of distortion. And of course, there's the entire history of so-called noise music, which is based also, to a large extent on the idea of distortion. Not only, but distortion is crucial there as an aesthetic component. That is desirable, it's voluntary, it's forceful, it's explicit, it's conscious. So all of those things are there. This is one thing. So again, my point there is that not only for the most extreme forms of use of distortion in music, but also for other more mainstream today and popular today forms of music, distortion is there, present as an aesthetic decision. This is one thing. The second thing that also it's relevant for me and probably unknown for a lot of people is that there's many different types of distortion. There's many different kinds of distortion. There's many different ways distortion appears in the analog media, in digital media. There's different limits for distortion, and there's many different ways. Distortion is not just in the recordings in a uniform way. Sometimes distortion blurs the rest of the audio that is there or overpowers the rest of the audio. Sometimes distortion is a little layer on top of anything else that is there, still clearly audible. Sometimes distortion is occasional, punctual, and it adds to the rest of the palette of sounds that you're listening to. Sometimes distortion is in the background, sometimes it's in the foreground. Distortion is a whole world, and so making decisions as to how to use distortion and how much distortion to allow there from a recording or from the work in the studio afterwards, is a universe in itself. So when I say, and I've done this in a number of different pieces, not only in this case with conveyor belts, because there were some distortions that appear there because of the thumbs and the movements and the falling of the checked-in baggage through the handling systems. but also in many other works that I've done where distortion appeared in the process of the evolution of the sounds as I was working in the studio with the sounds. You might decide that some distortion is undesirable from your subjective personal perspective, and you might decide that some distortion is really, really good in the context, in a musical sense, in a compositional sense, and that's my take on this. So whatever distortion is there, both in this album and in other albums of mine, it was very deliberate. It was very forceful. It was very clear decision that to me, it was the right type of distortion at the right time, in the right proportion. So let's put it that way. So again, distortion, as with silence, so-called silence, our elements, our universe, our fields of work, our fields of material and fields of possible work for composition and for creating work with sound.
Fabulous. And also as well to address the concept of the record specifically, like I say, it's such an exciting concept. It's really elegant as well. I feel like this is kind of self-evident, but why did you think it would be an interesting thing to do, to leave your recorder on while checking in your baggage?
Mm-hmm. Well, it happens with many other examples. Sometimes you experiment. Sometimes you're curious to try something. You're not sure. In this case, I wasn't sure. I imagined some of the things, and some of the things that happen are sort of similar to some degree to what I more or less imagined. But certainly, I wasn't expecting what I got, and from the recordings. I was careful with a number of different, the recording level. I imagine it should be conservative with the expected, mistreatment of the baggage that we imagined as it happens always, right? Uh-huh. And so also it is also possible today, more possible today than it had been like 10 years, 20 years ago, because portable recorders are so cheap, compared to the nobody will put a very valuable recording gear in the check-in baggage in the way I did it, because I had to put it in ways that will be not too muffled. So it had to be protected, but not excessively protected in order to record something. Mm-hmm. So anyway, in short, this is also possible at this time, because it is possible to have cheap recorders. And anyway, I didn't expect the richness that I heard. And when I heard the first one, then I was like totally into like doing all the have these planned flights in the US in a short period of time. So it was a no-brainer to do it again and again to see what would happen in different airports. But I was really surprised, because it's very rich. It sounds like a composed thing. It has like a structured sequence of combinations of sounds. The imaginary fields, the virtual fields of sound that you hear, and then the spaces you imagine, because we cannot see those spaces, is astonishing. The diversity of those things and the way the changes happen is like a. And in fact, it reminded me, maybe this is my biased perception, but it reminded me of the way I like to work with sudden cuts in sounds and like extreme edits and extreme changes and sudden changes, temporal changes. So all of those things were there, sort of in a natural way happening. It is also this element of acousmatic, true acousmatic environments. We don't know those environments. We can't see those places. We cannot go into those places. So what happens here is something that combines your imagination with the results with this as a sonic sort of testimony of an adventure or a trip or a nightmare that we cannot go through because we are not the baggage. And then so it has all of these different layers. But to me, the reason why I decided to create an album is because the sonic results of that were interesting by themselves. And I wouldn't have done an album if I would have gotten just pure distortion with and with the same context. In that sense, I am not a sound artist as what is most typically understood today, and I'm much more of a composer.
Francisco, I'll include links to, certainly to that record, and people should obviously keep abreast of what you're up to in record announcements to find out about that.
Bandcamp is the best now.
Yeah, on your Bandcamp. Fantastic. Okay, I'll include links to that. Perfect. So
thank you.
Let's go to your important records now. So one question I like to ask at this point is how you think about the word important in relation to this list of 3 records. So was there a way that you understood that word in order to come up with the records that you did?
Probably, I think it's probably a combination of my personal taste, but also the impact those records had in my personal understanding of music and music making. But also, I would say there is the assumption as well that those 3 records in a wider context of these 3 records as representatives, as examples of movements or moments in history, in music history, the impact they probably had for millions of other people. So I would think of these examples as important in a wider context than my personal experience.
Okay, great. So let's go for your first important record. What one do you want to go for first?
Well, perhaps the soundtrack of Eraserhead by David Lynch and Alan Splett.
Perfect. Okay, great. So maybe start by giving me a little introduction as to why this one's important to you.
One of my strongest memory as a teenager was when I went to a movie theater, one of those art movie theaters that existed in the 70s and throughout the 80s. And I went to one of these movie theaters, unaware of what I was going to watch. I went to see Eraserhead. For some reason, they were playing this on one of these art movie theaters in Madrid. I was born and I lived in Madrid when I was a teenager, and so I knew it was something weird that I could, but there was very little information I had about. I didn't know anything about David Lynch. I didn't know anything about the movie. I saw the poster and I thought that was weird image of the poster and intriguing, and cannot even remember exactly what I knew, but I knew very little. So I went into the theater and I watched Eraserhead. And I was obviously blown away, by a number of different reasons. And it was one of the weirdest films I have had ever, or probably the weirdest at the time, film that I had seen. And seeing this in a movie theater was really, really weird. I remember that there were very few people in the theater. That was common in those art cinemas at that time. And most of those people left the theater, like probably, I guess, outraged. Like, what the heck is this? This is nonsense and is absurd and is ugly. And I was absolutely fascinated. I think that fascination, to a large extent, was caused by the soundtrack. To me, it was like having that kind of story, that kind of environment that Eraserhead portrays, which to me is sort of like is one of the best expressions of the industrial era, the industrial culture. That's what I mean, industrial culture, as it was understood in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s. Even if David Lynch, probably there's nothing explicit about it, but I think it's clear in the way the atmosphere and the film and the story and the industrial environment is sort of like post-apocalyptic, strange, unexplained situation, all those characters. And the soundtrack had a very strong impact. The soundtrack was this drony world. It created that world. Sound in that film, I think, is a prime example of how a world is created through sound, how the impression, not just emotions, not just punctuation on the drama and the narrative of the film, but much more the world where these things are happening, where these characters live. That world is built upon, to a large extent, the sound that is always present. And this presence of sound I had never seen before in any film. So that had a dramatic impact on me on a very probably subconscious level. It was unclear to me what was the story, what happened there, why. I didn't have any of the context of the work of David Lynch or the intentions or the culture of something like that. And I knew very little about industrial culture and had other very, very scant examples of other works with sound. I knew about Throbbing Gristle and SPK and other bands at the time, but this was a very strong. And also because, you don't see any how these things were made. To me, there were so many questions and how these sound environments have been created. You don't think of instruments, you don't think of synthesizers or other tools that were common at the time for creating electronic music or equivalent. This is, of course, before computers. And in music, and there were so many questions, so intriguing and so fascinating that to me that was like, oh, well, this is an amazing soundtrack for a crazy film, and that to me. Probably the main impact and the importance of this album and this creation of the soundtrack for a film is how many questions that triggered in my mind, musically, sonically.
And when you talk about that being the impact, I mean, you said that a lot of it is subconscious, but I guess it's been a while since you've seen this film. I wonder if any of the more explicit aspects of the impact on you have become apparent over time. Are there things that you look back on now and say, do you know what? Eraserhead was probably where I learned that was, compelling or exciting.
Well, it probably taught me the semi-unconscious lesson that you can actually try to have something that crazy in something that some people will go and watch or listen. So public. This is in the context of my personal history and the history of Spain at the time, because I grew up, as I said, I grew up in Madrid. Madrid is a big city. It was a big city, but this is literally immediately post-Franco times in Spain. So there was very little information. Spain had been cut off the rest of Europe for like 40 years, basically, and isolated to a large extent culturally in many different ways. So any little scrap of any little fragment of information or cultural, products from, anywhere else in the world that was not mainstream, that was not like the most typical things, commercial things in the radio or TV, was like a reviving. It was like a trigger for so many things. So I think this created a layer, a base. This was not the only thing, of course, but this one had a very strong impact, probably because it was associated with the film, probably because I realized, wow, there's a film. Somebody made a film like this. It's being shown in theaters, and you can have this kind of very, very crazy, very non-commercial thing in a film, even if it's minoritary. So it probably showed me the lesson that, it's good to, and at the time I couldn't even dream of the idea that I could be, doing a concert or releasing an album or anything like that. But it taught me the lesson that, no matter how crazy, you should go for the things that are attractive to you, that are exciting, that are, that look interesting to you. And that contributed. It had a very strong contribution, I suppose, to my determination to proceed with whatever my ideas, my taste, my curiosity will lead me to. So it had a very strong contribution towards that.
I've seen Eraserhead once, a long time ago, and this is a recurrent theme with Lynch's films, in that the fact that I watch them is kind of secondary to how they take residence in my head and what I perceive them to be in retrospect, because obviously just what gets left in your mind is the weirdness, how unsettling it felt to inhabit that for a long time, and this sense that my body's kind of warning against going back in and doing it again. I wonder how your relationship has changed. Sorry, go on.
So in relation to that, I think the main quality of David Lynch, there's a lot of part of the work of David Lynch that to me is not that interesting. But I think there's a main quality for me in the work of David Lynch that is present throughout his entire career, even through films that don't seem to be so obscure. Of course, there's always this dark element in all his films, but there's one element to me is that which relates to what you just said, which I think Lynch is capable of having a strong, almost psychoanalytic impact, a psychological unconscious impact in people with details and with elements in the film that seem to be secondary, but they become primary in your memory of the film and in your feeling about a film. And then so the story is they're many times secondary to the main reason or the main quality, I would say, the main interest of the film throughout his entire career. And I think that is present from Eraserhead to that one with the monkey, the recent one.
Right, yeah.
I don't even remember the title, but I watched that one relatively, a couple of years ago or something when it came out, and I was like, "Well, that's my David Lynch."
Yeah, nice. With Eraserhead, have you seen it many times since, and have you felt your relationship with the film change since that initial exposure?
It's been a while. It's been actually years. I don't know how many years. It's been a while since last time I saw it. That will be a sort of an experiment to watch it now and see how I feel about it. I'm not sure about that. I'm a little bit afraid because of the place that it has in my memory and in my appreciation. But it's been a while. I saw it a few times, yes, but it's been years that I haven't seen it.
I saw in a separate feature where you picked some important records, this came up again, and you said, I think this was with Dusted, that this is one of those rare cases where you feel the film without the soundtrack would be so much less, which I think gives a little insight maybe as to your general perception of how film soundtracks contribute to the world of the film. So is it very rare for you to find value in the soundtrack of cinema?
No, I mean, I've done, even myself, and I'm, have this reputation for not being visual, not working with visuals. I've done occasionally soundtracks or something like soundtracks for different visual works, including film, including I did probably the most dedicated work that I've done was for a documentary called Technocalypse on technology and the apocalypse, religion and technology, transhumanism, basically, that I did in the 90s with Frank Thijs. He's a film director from Belgium, and he did this 3-part documentary for television called Technocalypse, and he did the soundtrack for that. So soundtracks, I love the idea of the soundtrack, and I think, but I think whoever wants to learn about the relevance of soundtracks and the role of soundtracks and the place of a soundtrack in the world of cinema should read Michel Chion, the writer the author who has written and published more about sound in cinema in the most elaborated, sophisticated, intelligent, and profound ways, I think. So his famous book Audiovision is a good example. And by the way, he talks extensively about David Lynch work. So personally, what I think is clear in many cases how the soundtrack not only contributes to the film or enhances the film or supports the film, but really constructs some essence in the film. I think that will be the case of also of a very well-known case, a repeated case of a composer who works systematically with a film director that most people will be familiar with, which is Nino Rota. Nino Rota did most of the soundtracks for the films of Fellini. And I think the universe, the dreamy, fantastic universe of Fellini is based to a large extent on the work of Nino Rota. I think Nino Rota built that world of memories, that world of fantasies, that erotic world, that fantasy world that Fellini develops. He creates that along with Fellini, and I think Fellini understood that when he worked systematically with Nino Rota throughout his entire career. And I think this is one thing. The other thing I would like to mention is that I think there are some cases where we should call what we're watching in a cinema a film track, not a soundtrack. I think there are cases where it's questionable what comes first. It's questionable what has more relevance. And I've been working on this idea as well. And then I'm interested in this idea of creating. I mean, the world of music videos is based on that principle, although this is an entire different animal. But the principle that there is a song, and then we're going to build something visual that is interesting around that song. Something like that happens with some films, and I think but it's a matter of subjective assessment or opinion. But I think some films are more sound construction, and then the film and the story is a film track to the sound.
Yeah, for sure. It feels like maybe with Lynch that there's an awareness of the primacy of the visual, and when we talk about the fact that a lot of the content of the film sticks in the head in that psychoanalytical fashion, I think that sound is a lot of that. And the fact that you're not able to explicitly haul up the sonic details that are having that effect on you is maybe how it has that amorphous presence in your head of like, why can't I stop thinking about this this film,
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think this is, I think it will be interesting to sort of, and this is one of my I would say attempts, or I'm working in that in different ways in that direction too. And the idea that sound should be also could be also it is a driving force when it comes to the combination of creating narrative. It will be very interesting to. Start a narrative, create a fiction, create a film, but that starts with the sound, not with the images. And I'm not talking about simply like something like putting images to, something that just goes along with it. I'm talking about something more sophisticated, building a story, building a narrative, starting with the sound and starting with something that is not a narrative, or building the sound narrative and then creating the images for that narrative, or telling a story with sound and then creating the images for the sound. Then there won't be a film director. There will be a sound director, and then there will be a film soundtrack created by someone.
Okay, so this is a project that you're working on presently?
Yes. In a number of ways. It's not easy, and it's a sort of it's a bit utopian because fighting not just the industry, I would say the industry, the big film industry, or even the experimental video film world. The difficulty there is cultural more than the conglomerate of the big industry and money. The cultural difficulty is how to break with the concept of what is a film director, who directs there. The film. And I have a little experience here. Film, has the making of film culturally has a structure that is reminiscent of the military. Basically, the film director is the absolute top general there. Then there's like different status. The photography director is like, it's like a captain or whatever you might think of, but it's very, very structured that way. And it doesn't matter how much different people contribute to the film. The film is the work of the director. Fighting against this structure, or not fighting against, but trying to say, okay, well, let's think about it in a different way, alternative version of this. It's very difficult because it doesn't matter what you do. And I have a personal experience with this of a film that I worked with that was created from the sound. And then the film director, whoever worked with the images, becomes the author. I am just a composer who did a soundtrack for that film, when in fact it was the reverse. So going against that cultural, very, very established idea, it's an utopian battle. But, we can always work on different examples and show those examples.
Francisco, let's go to your second important album. Again, if you could give me the name of it and then a little bit about why it's important to you too.
Well, perhaps around the same time and completely unconnected, or maybe not completely, but I mentioned as a choice of an album, an important album, Horde by the Mnemonists. Horde is one of the early albums of this conglomerate of people, mnemonists, the mnemonists, and also later called, or later using the name, some of them using the name Biota. And mnemonists and Biota is basically a conglomerate of people based in Colorado in the US, and where what I find interesting about this group of people is that, well, it's a conglomerate of some musicians and visual artists. The work that they do for the album covers over the years was part of the sort of the integrated concept, and this is very common in the history of music, of course, and in pop music and rock and roll, in experimental music is very common. What I find interesting about mnemonists, and particularly this album, is a very good example of that, is that they work to a large extent by doing improvisation sessions in studio, and then working through long sessions. This is also common practice for a lot of musicians. But their main aim is not to point in the direction of looking at the improvisation and bringing the ethos of improvisation that is common in the world of improvised music. But improvisation as a generator of interesting materials. And then they work with many hours of recordings, and then they do this second stage in the process of not just documenting. They don't record those sessions in order to document their improvisation sessions, but they do it in order to create something that I would say composing in the best possible imaginable sense of the term. They create this very interesting, obscure, and inscrutable worlds of sound from those materials having worked. So it is like a collective where there is generation of materials, interesting materials and combinations that are generated mostly by means of instruments, but they end up sounding like really non-instrumental or a weird instrumental world. Biota is an example of, I would call it like, it's like pseudo-music in the sense that not as a lesser category of music, but as a category, as a type of music practice that you feel that it sounds like music, but it's not really there. It's like music in the making, music not happening, or music happening in weird ways, unexpected ways, because of the way it has been first improvised, then worked out in the studio. This combination to me is particularly interesting because it points the direction of really looking at music making, not so much at the ethos of music practice, which is my main critique of improvisation as an ethical project, not as a musical project. I think there's too much, in my opinion, this is a very personal take on this, there's an excess of ethos in improvisation that sort of blurs, obscures the potential of improvisation. I think we all use improvisation, musicians and sound creators and composers. We all improvise to some degree at some stage, and sometimes to a large extent, but that doesn't mean that we have to show the improvising, or we have to present, or we have to defend, or have to be brave to show those things in public and in the life moment. I think those things are more ethical decisions than musical decisions, and I respect those decisions. But I think in that take, but it's not personally. I don't find it very enlightening, and I don't think that contributes to the experience of music. So. Mnemonist and Horde as an album, I think, represents sort of a very interesting turnaround of this principle of improvisation and generation of materials, and in a very interesting way. So to me, that represents that original take on this.
I want to dig into that, your personal critique of improvisation a little bit, just to make sure I'm following it, really. So is it the fact that with improvisation, the improvisation is granted this kind of centrality where everything's recorded in long takes? The whole purpose of it is to center on the improvisation, and that's at the exclusion of, many of the other ways in which improvisation may be wielded in the context of like other crafts. Or could you dig into that a little bit more for me? Am I on the right lines?
Yeah, I think in my opinion, improvisation as a practice puts too much relevance it's too emphatic, it's too weighted on the side of accepting what happens in the moment, almost to the point of a religious, semi or pseudo-religious take on this, which is basically ethical. That's pseudo-religious, most people will call ethical. It's unethical. To me, the project of improvisation, as is understood, the standard, the most common understanding of the weight, the relevance of improvisation is based on an ethical idea, not on a musical idea. There's music being made. Yes, there are instruments. Yes, of course, but there's this ethical component that is there, and that is attractive for the people who practice improvisation and for the people who like to listeners or public audience of improvisation. This is happening in the moment, whatever happens here, and we have to accept it. This acceptance to me is pseudo-religious. Why should we do that? What is the principle behind that? I think is, if you want to do it, of course you can do that, but why is that better than anything else? Why that's a higher ground, ethical ground? Because you're there's the language of improvisation. It's if you look at it, if you read, if you listen to what is being said about improvisation, you will see that it's a language that uses these ideas that you need to accept what happens in the moment, and that is part of the music, the instant music making. And also, it's very common to hear this expression, taking risks. And I don't understand that risk. What is the risk there? The risk,
right.
the risk of what? The risk of something. If you say that, I mean, it's very revealing. If you accept the idea that you're taking risks, means that there's something bad that might happen or has happened. What is that bad thing that happened that can happen because there is a risk of something happening? And I suppose the bad thing or the undesirable thing is that something you don't like, something you dislike, or something that you think is failed or is weak or is not. And that is an implicit acceptance of something that there's wrong there. So
right.
if you want to do it, I'm fine with that. I respect that. But I just don't like that sort of higher ethical ground tint that is there. I think it's completely. Also, I can put this in a different way. I do improvise a lot. I do when I'm working on something, and in many different ways. I improvise when I decide where to record, what to record, and when I have tons of hours of recordings or whatever, and I'm working with materials, I improvise all the time. I improvise what I'm doing with them. I improvise how I combine them or not. If I do something to them or not. I improvise a lot of things. I experiment constantly. But there's a difference between me doing that and me showing this to an audience in expecting anyone to be interested in watching this process or being the spectator of this process. And there's a difference here between the technical and the musical in the best sense of the term, meaning the sharing of a musical experience. I could technically show some of that if I wanted to do it, but that is not gonna become the core of my what I do in a public situation to share with people. So I can share the technical at a very basic level, but that's not good. Sharing the technical and sharing in public, the moments where those things happen, to me, it is not going to create a more interesting experience of anything. So that ethos to me is, and it's insubstantial, is not really supported by any strong argument or thought, really. And another thing, second thing or third thing that for me is very relevant is that there are many things that happen in improvisation that are always a repetition of a sort of improvisation generates many cliches in a live situation for natural reasons. So it generates many cliches in the interaction between musicians, in the way musicians listen to each other, and in the things that can happen. There are many things that cannot happen with improvisation live. It's impossible. There are things that have to do with coordinating musicians that cannot happen. They happen with a lucky accident, of course, sometimes, but they cannot happen. There's many things that, like sudden changes in the music, in the collective music making, cannot happen because there's nothing. There's many things that musically are banned from equalization, banned in the not in the sense that there's anyone stating that those things cannot happen, is that they can naturally not happen. It's impossible. And in that respect, improvisation tends to produce very repetitive music repetitive in the worst sense of the term, music that becomes, in my opinion, boring because you know what's going to happen. And it's a paradox. It's a paradox to what is supposed to be very free and very open ends up producing very predictable results. Improvisation as a musical practice with instruments as we know it, as we understand it today in the present, in my opinion, produces very predictable results. And in many cases, that to me is boring. So I have very little interest precisely because of that. And so I don't want to be ethically happy and musically bored.
So with Mnemonis and Horde, I mean, I feel like that we've kind of addressed this in a roundabout way already, but what was the impact on you in terms of hearing this record? Like, how did that impact manifest for you?
Well, again, I placed this selection of albums in a wider context, and then I would say Mnemonists at the time, and was one of the collectives of. It showed me again something that I was sort of striving or imagining possible in my personal future that eventually didn't happen, which was collaborating with other artists in having such a collective of artists. I think not all the decisions, of course, are made by all the people who contribute to the generation of sonic materials in Mnemonis or in Biota. But I think it was very interesting to see how a collective of people could generate something, a product like that was so solid, so strong, such a very strong statement. So it's not a lot of people doing crazy things and going all over the place. I think they're very focused on the direction of what they construct and what happens in the end, out of a million possibilities, I imagine. And to me, that was a very good lesson on being focused on something that has an atmosphere, that has a very clear aesthetic. It's very solid aesthetically, and that to me that was very, very important, as it was in the work of or very different collectives at the time, around the same time. This is early 80s, like White House, for example. White House, the band from the infamous band from England, was also very influential, and it was also for with completely different music or completely different noise work. It was very influential in that sense. It was also very, very solid, very, very solid, and some people would say very monochromatic or very repetitive in the aesthetic, but so solid and so different to any other music. For me, the difference, being different at a certain time, and not systematically, but at certain times, and being different in interesting ways, is always have had a very strong impact, and it's a good quality. So both in different ways. Both Mnemonists and White House, for example, were very different to most of the music of the time, most of the experimental music of the time. And to me, that was very, it's a solid call for my attention.
Yeah, for sure. And as you say, there's a real value to when this music emerged. So do you still listen to Horde Mnemonists generally? And if so, has your relationship with this kind of music changed at all?
Well, I do listen to this album. I mean, I don't remember when was the last time I listened to this album, but I do listen to the music of the Mnemonists and Biota as well. And when they're, in fact, I created an exhibition in 2020, in infamous 2020. I created an exhibition of audio art and experimental music in Madrid, in Spain, for the National Museum of Contemporary Art. It was a very, very big project, and one of the artists, I invited more than 800 artists from all over the world. And one of them, or in this case a band, was Biota, was the people who today still continuing the work of the Mnemonists. Now they've taken a lot of different directions, and they tend to be very folky, and that's, to me, is less interesting. But still, I respect their work, and I respect that they sort of created their own terrain. Creating your own terrain, of course, not out of the blue, not out of nowhere. We all have connections with a cultural, milieu and our moment in history. But I think there's a few examples of bands or artists who create, or a little bit, or to a large extent, their own territory or their own direction. And I think Mnemonis Biota is one of them. I mentioned White House. The Residents are another historical example of that. The Residents also created their own sort of music, in a way. And again, not out of the blue, but they have consistently, solidly created their own world. And that's something I appreciate. So I do listen, every once in a while. They're part of my listening for many years experience, the work of Mnemonis and Biota, yes.
Francisco, we got one more important record. Again, if you could give me the name of it and then a little bit about why it's important to you.
Well, this my last choice of important album was Chaosphere by Meshuggah. Meshuggah is a metal band from Sweden, and became very popular. I think that was one of the big metal bands. And I think there's again in this case there's one of the reasons why I mentioned this album and selected this is because of the creation of that own territory within the world of metal. I think Meshuggah created their own territory that now is imitated worldwide by many different bands, and even created a genre, this djent or djent or whatever they call it.
Yeah.
I think that was basically the instigated and created the ground for that. It was created by Meshuggah. And the first time I heard Meshuggah, and I wouldn't consider myself to be a metalhead. I'm not, but let me put it this way: when I hear quality, I always say, "Well, this is good." And of course, this is absolutely subjective. Of course, this is my personal opinion, but I think there's a few examples of metal throughout the years that I find particularly interesting. So most metal bands I will have very little interest, but occasionally I find something. And the first time I heard Meshuggah, I had the impression this is different. This is different, and this is different for a number of different reasons. Of course, they're incredible musicians, but there's a lot of incredible musicians in the world of metal, heavy metal, and it was not just that, and it is not just that. I think what metal fans appreciate in Meshuggah, I think they appreciate that they created this very, very solid personal world that includes virtuosistic playing of the instruments, the guitars, the drums, but also very, very solid original style. Some people would say that I think contributed to and the contribution to, let's say, the history of metal. It's very, very significant. Chaosphere as an album, I think I think the first. I'm not completely sure about this, but in my perception, is the first album by Meshuggah that is that solid.
Yeah.
Other albums after Chaosphere try to do that, like Nothing, for example, the album Nothing, and other albums, or Colosse. Colosse is also an album that I really like. And so I would say, yeah, I like most of the albums of Meshuggah after Chaosphere, and even if I liked their work before, and I knew Meshuggah before Chaosphere, but with Chaosphere, I felt, wow, this is like an album that is as solid. The album itself is the work and not individual songs or individual parts of the songs. So this is really a very, very solid album in itself. It retained the production of the album is fantastic, and it generated the darkest and deeper atmosphere that Meshuggah can create, and that they have used ever after in to different degrees. So I think Chaosphere for me, it has that essence in raw form, and it has this solid base of having the album split into songs is sort of secondary to the album. This is my perception of Chaosphere.
Yeah. What do you think it is about? So you mentioned the fact that there are metal bands that have generated their own sound and, jut out from other bands working within that genre. Full disclosure, Meshuggah is like the most important band in my life. I did my own 3 important albums, and I picked Nothing, the 2002 version, as one of my important picks. Mm-hmm. So I have my own thoughts on this, but what is it about the world that they've generated that you find compelling?
Okay, there's all of the prototypical elements of metal. They twisted them. They twisted percussion. The drums. The way they work with the drums, and the rhythmic interaction between drums and the rhythmic part of the guitars. I think that is incredibly complex and interesting. It's like syncopated in ways that are unexpected in metal. The guitar solos. The guitar solos are like this almost experimental music. It's like really weird harmonies, and the harmonic direction of the guitar solos goes in a completely different direction than most of the previous heavy metal solos. So they contribute in ways that are original, unexpected, and still it works. It works. It's not something that is not disconnected. So the complexity of the interaction between the different musicians, while maintaining such a solid sound and such a solid, metal presence of all together is just absolutely impressive. It's very original, and or it was very original at the time, in the context of metal. So I don't think of Meshuggah as a band that has its own sound. Many bands have their own sound. They're original in their own sound as band, and you can recognize them. It's more than that. To me, Meshuggah sort of contributed a new strand, a new layer, a new direction, a new possibility within the idea of metal, and that's a very difficult thing to do. I think within the world of metal, metal works in all directions by excess. We go to the excess of distortion, with the excess of volume, to the excess of putting all the instruments, the massive sound coming from all the instruments to the limits. We work with excess of virtuosistic speed or sometimes. And so there's a lot of excess that, and in that context, it's difficult to imagine what can we do here that will move this in an interesting, appealing new direction. And the appeal of Meshuggah was there from the beginning. So Meshuggah is very popular, I think, because it is the perception of a lot of people into metal that they realize it's good. It sounds good. It's good and it's different. So I think that contribution is there for reasons that have to do with musical complexity and on the one hand, and on the other hand with the maintaining a very, very solid sound for the concept of what is to do metal music.
One thing for me that really juts out with them is that they were one of the first bands, maybe the first band I heard, where virtuosity and complexity wasn't synonymous with like speed or running up and down the fretboards. Some of the riffs, I think, on Chaosphere are minimal in a way that they never return to again. Just a single palm muted chug, like on the mouth licking what you've bled in the verse, just to have something that reduced. They never really returned to. So I was kind of surprised to hear you say, for example, that you really connect with Kolos, because I've said this to a lot of friends where I kind of perceive their most interesting period to run up until about 2005. And then they start to almost express this desire to be a metal band again and do something that sounds more almost groovy and kind of funky and something that resembles music more so. So I don't know whether you had any opinions on that. It sounds like maybe your opinion diverges.
So what do you think about Bleed?
I enjoy Bleed as a song, and it's constructed really nicely, but it feels to me like a metal song in a way that Chaosphere and Nothing just don't. Nothing for me was interesting because it's the sound of a band trying to grapple with this tuning and guitars that almost protested against being tuned like that, which was so unmetal, because metal feels like it's so much about mastery and that kind of dynamic, and Bleed expresses that, and I think it's a really well-constructed piece. But Obscene is maybe my least favorite Meshuggah album of them all.
I probably agree with you. I think, but on the other hand, I don't know how long you could sustain such a direction, such an odd direction. So if you do Chaosphere 2 or something like it, how long we will sustain that? That's a more of a theoretical question. Yeah, we might agree on that, but I don't know how else, because maybe that's how far you can go with this new idea and within the context of metal, and somebody else has to come. Maybe Meshuggah cannot do a second invention or a second step in the invention of different directions or something like it. That's another, is a different question. Yeah, of course, as it happens also in all forms of popular music, what most of the people want is a repetition of the previous albums to some degree. So that stifles creation, and for a lot of different artists, and maybe that is the case here too. But it's like, if you look at I don't know, AC/DC, what can you expect from AC/DC after more AC/DC? And that's what people want, more AC/DC. So where maybe those are the limits of the invention.
Yeah, and there's something lovely about the fact that they did catch 33, which literally has a snake eating its own tail, and then progressed to something slightly different. So maybe they even knew they'd run out of road. I was going to say, with Chaosphere, do you, as you say, it's kind of like a solid block of material, but do you have a favorite track?
Not really. I don't remember right now. I haven't listened to the album in a while, but I don't remember a specific. I think what I do remember, as opposed to other Meshuggah albums from Chaosphere, is that it was that thing. It was, like I said before, is like, any track randomly. You could play the shuffle in the CD player when we were playing those things on CD, and it will be the same album anyway, and it will work in any direction in terms of the track. So I think it is the album itself as a solid piece that really has that presence and that solidity and that novelty.
Have you seen them live?
Yes, once. Sorry, I was thinking of Napalm Death for some reason. No.
Right. Okay. How was? When was that?
Good.
How was it? Yeah.
Meshuggah, I think it was. Let me think. 2000. Probably 2005, 2006. I think. Only once I saw them live. Yeah, I think it was around that time. Yeah. Well, I tell you what was my overwhelming impression is that, of course, they were good live and all that clearly, but I prefer to listen to them on record. It was so loud that you couldn't actually hear the.
Oh, right.
But I guess that's a common thing. It's very difficult to convey something like that. I think convincingly in a live show. So I guess most or many live shows of metal bands are so loud that you cannot actually hear the music or what you will hear when you listen to the records. So it is exceptional when you have good sound at that level, at that volume, at that presence. So the one that I saw that was in Madrid, actually, I wouldn't say the sound was bad. The sound engineers were not doing a good job. I think it was a combination of factors that are common to many different venues. It's the venue combined with the sound system and etc. And of course, it sounds as loud as you can get, as you can take, but that's not enough. That's not convincing enough. So to me, the experience was not that great. I could see, well, they as good live as they could be in the record, but listening to this is not going to be like listening of experience of a record. So it was not a good experience in that sense.
Final question on Meshuggah, unless you had anything else, but what kind of impact did this have on you? Like, why is this now an important record that, in 2023, when someone mentions it, this one still comes to mind? What's the impact been on you?
Well, I think you never know where the influence of something like this might show up in your work when apparently so different. And of course, I have done, some people might be aware of this, I've done a few works with based on metal music and sort of like my take on recombining. I would say I don't like the term plandophonics. I think it's a misleading term, but I would say recombining, recombining metal music as can be done with other types of music. And I've done a few of those. I did an album that was just crazy mash-up recombination of many different metal bands. So I have an interest in that kind of sound. I have an interest in that kind of power, that kind of noise component, and in certain ways, not just raw blast volume, but so it is to some extent it is part of my aesthetic, and I've done a lot of work that is very noisy and very dense, and even if not rhythmic like that. So the contribution of Meshuggah to that is to show me and to contribute to that pool of memories and that pool of taste building materials that generate that impression of depth with the sound, complexity, and richness. They're good at also combining things with a lot of density, and there's a feature of my work as well. In general, I like complexity and I like density, but with clear elements there present and with clarity in density. And I think Meshuggah it's one more contribution to that perception. I think. Growing up as a composer or as an audio artist, somebody who is interested to work with sound, growing up and in sophistication in what you do depends on a number of listening experiences with a lot of variety in those experiences in many different ways. And I think Meshuggah has contributed to my constitutions or reconstitution as a composer, as somebody interested in music in a very, very wide sense.
Francisco, one more question I have for you is about how you tend to listen to music, or how music comes into your life. So do you have preferred places to go to buy music or acquire music? Do you have preferred formats? Yeah, tell me a bit about that.
Right. Well, my experience for many years now has been, as a lot of people know, it's been, I get my music through direct exchange with other artists. Over the years, I've changed, and I keep exchanging music directly with artists and small labels in a number of course, before digital editions in physical form, and still today in physical form, of course, for many, many years, with literally thousands of artists all over the world. So that is the source of my music, the main one. And there is so much music that I've changed. And because I also exchange with labels, I also get to exchange and receive music that are by artists that I don't know about, or by new people, new younger artists and new artists on a regular basis for decades now. And that is, I would say, the main way. With the rise of present day digital self-releasing through different platforms online, and predominantly Bandcamp, of course, today, you can also get to know the music of so many different people just by moving around, exploring, navigating that universe. And I do that on a regular basis. When I created that exhibition I was mentioning before in 2020 in Madrid, I set up a task for myself to include in that exhibition artists that I've never heard about before. And a good proportion, probably around a third of the artists in that exhibition, were people I didn't know about before starting to work in the exhibition, even if I've exchanged with thousands of artists for many years. And I did discover through online listening, through streaming in many different platforms, and through advice from different people, many artists. So my interest in listening, one of the relevant things for me when listening, I don't care about formats. I'm not a nostalgic person. I don't care about, and I don't think any physical format is better than, and certainly vinyl, for example, is not better than digital formats, that's for sure. So I'm not a fetishist or anything like that. When it comes to formats, I don't care. To me, formats are relevant only to the extent that will entice people to listen. So if anyone is enticed to listen, is encouraged to listen because you have received a vinyl record, so be it. So that's welcome in that sense, but only to the extent that the format will trigger the interest in listening in people. So whatever format does that, in whatever way, to me, that's the relevance of the format, nothing else. And so I received a lot of different physical records, vinyls, cassettes, lots of them today, CDs, etc., as well as loads of course, streaming links to different digital albums, etc. And so I do all kinds of formats in that sense, and I am very interested in exploring new artists and discovering new things. And I am happy to say I'm one of those people who think that the overwhelming amount of material that is created today is a happy consequence of the right to create that many more people have today than as it was in the past and years ago. And we have to accept that the price we pay for the right of anyone to create is to have this entire universe avalanche of impossible to cope with amount of creation. That is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. That is a consequence of the right to create for a lot of people. So I don't think that it's bad that there's so much stuff. And of course, most of it I might not be interested, but who's to say that people don't have the right to do it?
And in all that abundance, you picked 3 awesome records for us to talk about, Francisco, and it's been wicked to talk through these records. And as well, your new projects, like I say, links will go in the show notes so that people can check those out. Thank you so much for your energy and time, as always, Francisco.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you for the interest, and thank you for having me for your podcast.
And to everyone listening, and see you next time. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.